Hello and welcome back to another episode of Cyber Voices, the official podcast of the Australian Information Security Association, otherwise known as AISA. I'm your host, as always, David Willett, and it is my pleasure to have you with us as we explore the diverse voices of the Australian cyber industry. Today I have the pleasure of chatting with Reece Corbett-Wilkins. Reece is a AISA New South Wales chapter committee member, but here today in his capacity as a senior incident lead for Clyde and Co. Reece is a leading member of Clyde and Co's cyber incident response team and has experience acting in a range of local, regional and global incidents affecting government agencies and private sector organisations of all sizes, operating across all industry sectors. Reece joined me to help unpack just what's going on with the Australian government's cybersecurity bill in 2024, and also just to hear a little bit about his career. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy Cyber Voices. How does someone develop into a cyber incident response lead for an organisation like CNC?
A lot of hard work, passion, and dedication for the cause, like anybody in this space.
I imagine.
To give people the history, I mean, we started back in 2014, well before cyber IR was popular. Always had an interest in technology and privacy right back from university days. So really trying to understand the intersection between technology issues, privacy issues, and people issues. And so for me, I started off my career as a technology litigation lawyer, but really it was kind of that skill set of crisis management, even in a litigation context, that made me think differently about this and realize way back then that there was an opportunity to try and build that out for organizations. I mean, data breaches were always around. Back then it was a lot of PCI breaches, and of course then it evolved and into ransomware and more recently other things too.
It's interesting. I've spoken to a few other people on the podcast since we started doing it who have a similar background in law or even law enforcement. The pivot they've made is usually about wanting to be a little bit closer to the action. Was it similar for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's part of our job, and what gets me out of bed every day is, unfortunately, for people that go through this, decision makers, leaders, IT security folk, going through a crisis or a data breach incident is probably one of the worst experiences in their careers, their professional lives, if they've not been through it before. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting academic stuff that we deal with. There's a lot of interesting legal stuff that we deal with, but fundamentally it's being able to connect with the person and provide that support to them. We get a lot of feedback from that's ultimately what it's about. It's the hand holding organizations through this.
Coming up in 2025, what do you think are some of the key focus areas based on what you're seeing and the interactions that you're having with your customers and some of the breaches that you've seen and worked on in the last 12 months?
So as we all know in this space, it can sometimes feel like you're fighting a never-ending battle and one that we're not winning, but I'm an optimist on this. I actually have seen that organizations have vastly improved where they were 5 years ago. For me, the big three top items are not just talking about incident types, but the first thing is supply chain risk management. That's a real gap that we can see at the moment right now. A lot of organizations are focused on kind of their own backyard, their own systems, their own controls, but the missing piece is how are they then working through with third parties that have control over their systems or indeed independently have their data, such as data processes. These kind of major events have really woken up the industry to say, we're kind of okay with our own systems, but it's actually now going deeper into our supply chain. So that's the first thing. If we could talk about nothing else next year, that's all I want to talk about.
We've embedded a lot of systems on the security side deep within our IT architecture and almost to single points of failure in some regards.
We can't really avoid that, but what we can do is learn from that and become more resilient, right? So the second big thing that I'm encouraging organizations to do is to really develop that resilience through tabletops and simulations. And I know that these have become more popular in the last few years. There's still lots of organizations that don't do them and don't do them often enough. But what we're encouraging organizations that have actually done these simulations and invested in peacetime so that they're ready for wartime, as it were, is to start thinking about your supply chain. So to my earlier point, pick a key supplier, pick a key customer, do a joint exercise with them, work out how will you work through this together, because that's where we're seeing quite a lot of the pinch occur at the moment, that kind of misalignment of how that would work in practice as between each other through the incident response lifecycle.
Interesting that you mentioned doing it with a key technology partner or just a key partner. Are you finding that organizations are willing to collaborate? Because I think some of us could see that as, oh, this could expose us a little bit, right? And not that that should be the way that people think about it. We absolutely want to change that. But what's the willingness to do that collaboration? What's some of the hesitation that we see there?
I think you've obviously got those at the mature end of the life cycle in terms of their cyber resilience journey. They're the ones that are leading this. So you'd be naive to think that everyone's going to jump in next year and start doing this for all the reasons you mentioned. But what we're trying to flush out in those mature conversations between key suppliers is really understanding, if this happens, what are you doing and what are we doing in response? Because often that's where we see the rub. They might have a contract which sets out exactly what's going to happen, but in practice, it very, very rarely follows what's in the contract, if there is even something in the contract that's between the parties. So it's really about bringing the parties together. And you're right, it's not an easy conversation to be had, but once you get over that, you start to realize that we're stronger together when we work together on these incidents.
I like that point, because I've tried to have these sort of conversations in my own professional life where we've woken up to the fact that if someone within our ecosystem has compromise, this is not like the days of COVID, where someone's tested positive to COVID and they need to lock themselves away for 2 weeks until they produce a negative test result. I use that comparison a lot when it comes to a cyber incident for a third party or someone who you're deeply integrated with. You can't actually afford to shut them out. You need to work with them. And you need to sort of have those peacetime conversations around how you will work with each other and what your risk tolerances are going to be like. So if your decision is that you're going to shut someone out as a result or disconnect them, whatever it might be, because they've been compromised, well, you also then need to be asking yourself, well, what do you need to see to be willing to turn them back on as well? And I can imagine that those would be some very powerful conversations to have in those exercises.
And that's it, right? The short answer is, if you do shut someone out of your environment, you're still dependent on them in some degree. And so it's really around your own resilience, is making sure that you can actually work through the incident together. Look, I think the last point I'll just make in terms of big picture for next year is cyber insurance. It's still a relatively unknown product and underutilized product. But what I'd say is this, is that the insurance industry, like never before, is as invested as clients are to drive down cyber risk. And they're moving away from a promise to pay and more into a promise to respond and a promise to protect model. The other point to make is that cyber insurance as a market has softened. It's never been cheaper to buy cyber insurance. There is more competition in the market at the moment. The wordings are broad, the offer is broad, and the time to buy is now. And I really think, particularly for the SME and mid-market entities out there who don't have sufficient capital or indeed an incident response capability built in-house, they're just completely left to their own devices post-incident. And we can see the difference between a well-handled incident response, either by a large corporate who has enough capital or indeed a mid-market client who has insurance, and then those that don't have it.
You mentioned the stuff around ransomware payment and all that as well. It seems to be, that's the question that everyone is so hung up on. It's, will we pay? Will we not pay? And I know that that's the question I get asked a lot, is just, what is even my own recommendation on it? And there's so much evidence, both, whether you should or you should not. Anecdotally, it sounds like there are a lot who are paying because, it's just maybe they don't have that recovery capability or the ability to, have that prolonged, sustained interruption. So there is the potential of an introduction of a mandatory ransomware payment reporting legislation in Australia. Now, this is all part of there is the cybersecurity bill, which has been happening. There's been a lot of consultation around it. What are some of the key elements of this mandatory reporting on ransomware payments that you're aware of? And how are you discussing this with your customers?
I think the first starting point is, why are we introducing this? And clearly we all want ransomware out of our lives. That's not going to happen anytime soon. What the government realized early on was that they have a gap in their data, in their visibility over how often is this happening, which industries are being impacted, which segments of our economy are being impacted, who's paying, how often, how much, and critically, who are they paying to? Because the government, without that information, can't actually then introduce intervention strategies such as policy, such as legislation, or indeed investing in law enforcement to go and actually disrupt cybercrime gangs. So the point about this is really to try and slow down that. The features of the legislation itself, essentially, if you're an organisation with revenues of over $3 million, you'll be required to report to the government within 72 hours of paying a ransom payment. The intention is that once you do so, the government will then step in and provide victim support to ensure that the business itself is able to take adequate steps in response to the incident. But also, if there's an impact to the community, we'll be able to then actually support the response strategy in terms of notifying and supporting affected individuals, getting supply chains back up and running again. So, look, I think you asked the question of how are we speaking to clients about it. In the short, what we're looking for is certainty, because at the moment, you've kind of got to tiptoe around the issue. It's a secret that no one wants to talk about, but we all accept happens in our community. So we're trying to lift the lid on it a little bit. But we also want to make sure that it's done in such a way that that information sharing is really confidential and is ultimately designed to support the victim and not overexpose them following a payment to a cyber criminal gang.
The bill does introduce a limited use disclosure framework for confidential information sharing. Do you know a little bit about how, or what is your reading of what that framework is designed to do and how it can protect that sensitive information being disclosed to unauthorized parties?
So this is the kind of the quid pro quo. So
yeah,
the deal is if you give us this information, we will, where we can, protect it, right? So in short, the limited use disclosure framework says that the ransom payment report and any other information provided along with it can only be used by the government for the purposes of supporting the victim resolve the incident, essentially. It cannot be used for prosecuting the business. It cannot be used to provide to regulators or class action lawyers, for example. And I think this is one of the key features in the reporting regime that probably has caused and is still causing a little bit of concern amongst the legal community and directors, which is if I share this information in good faith because I'm required to do so, if I openly admit that I've paid a ransom, what exposure do I have? There's some other concerns as well around potential waiver of legal professional privilege over legal advice, the materials including forensic reports, data risk assessments, etc. So, but my read on it is that the protection is there to give confidence, and it is a good thing. It's in the national interest that we're sharing this information, but it's really now up to the government to make sure that those guardrails that they're putting in place actually work as intended. And I think that's the bit that still needs to be worked through.
I can imagine that there could be organisations who could look at this sort of one or two ways, and that is the positive way, which I think I'm very aligned with there, which is, this is all about positive steps forward, encouraging poor organisations to be able to come forward and to say, like, okay, we're in this situation and we're in trouble, and we're victims here. And they're talking to the media about a cybercrime as well. They're actually victim of exactly that, a crime. But then there's all these competing government requirements and regulatory requirements and insurance requirements, which probably can make some organizations feel like this is a real no-win scenario for them.
Look, I think there's no director in this country that pays a ransom without gritting their teeth. It's a very well considered, for the most part, it's a very well considered decision, right? There's a lot of different factors that, to be frank, the sentiment that we get from directors is that they are getting pulled in different directions. There's no kind of clear pathway that is the right thing to do, one way or the other, paying or not paying. This hopefully gives them a little bit more comfort that if they do pay, then they can at least hopefully try to slow down the next attack, or in long-term view, stop these attacks. Because most directors will say, we're on Team Australia here, but first and foremost, they've got directors' duties. They've got a company to protect. They've got obligations in relation to sanctions. They've got a whole bunch of stuff that they're going through, putting aside the fact they can see that their business is in crisis. And so naturally, they have to consider their own interests and that of the business in the first instance, even if that means not necessarily considering the wider picture, the national Australian interests. So I think it's what we're trying to do is give a bit more clarity so that they don't feel like they're getting pulled in every single direction differently.
How much are people engaging in the ethical discussion as well?
So ethics is an interesting point. In almost every board conversation that we've had, it's always turned on this question, ethics. What's the right thing to do? Now, unfortunately, as you say, there's two or multiple sides to what is the right thing to do. No one wants to pay ransoms. They know inherently, of course, they're fueling cybercrime. They're fueling the next cyber attack against their neighbor, against their business, against their competitor, against their supplier. They know that. What they're trying to work out is what's in the best interest of our staff, what's in the best interest of our clients, what's in the best interests of the viability of this business. And often when you put up against the wall, and these threat actors are becoming much more sophisticated, They are taking backups. They are deleting your recovery prospects. Even if you're a mature organization, they're taking a lot more data. They're publishing that data. They're hyper-weaponizing that data. They're secondarily extorting other business victims whose data that relates to. They're posting on their site. They're creating indexes on their site for people to readily search for it. They know that there is a harm in not paying. But I think ultimately the good thing that I've seen over, particularly the last 5 years since early COVID 2020, 2021 days when this peaked, is that there is a greater resistance to pay at the moment. It used to be somewhere like 90% of organizations paid ransoms. Now it's probably closer to 30% based on our own numbers. And that number could change up or down depending on the cycle. So we are heading in the right direction. But unfortunately, there's still going to be situations where organizations are going to have to consider this.
Absolutely, yeah. And listeners, I don't know if you're coming away from this thinking that you've found the right answers. I think we're just really sort of trying to let you know it is a very complicated and tricky landscape in which you have to navigate. Something that else that's come up as well is the Cyber Incident Response Board, or the CIRB, as a notable provision within the legislation. What roles are these entities supposed to be playing, and how does that feed back into the general public?
So the CIRB is a new body that they're proposing to set up as part of these review packages. It's essentially a review board that will be set up to do a look back exercise into these larger incidents of national significance so that we can identify lessons that can be learned and shared with the broader business community and with government, so that we can all become more resilient at the back end of these incidents. The board itself will have 7 members, a chair, and then 6 standing members, and they'll all be experts in their field. They'll also be able to create an expert panel which sits underneath them to provide guidance into these investigations or look back exercises. Kind of take a step back to answer your question. We all love watching air crash investigation, right? Because you see these things happen, and it reveals a lot of things at the heart, some technology or governance failure, but also it reveals a human story. It reveals the efforts being undertaken by those at the heart of the incident, and what we can learn from that, both good and bad. And I think for me, to answer your question around how does it then feed back into resilience, the composition of the board will be critical to ensure that we get it right. But ultimately, if we can identify those broader lessons learnt and apply them going forward, then, by 2030, which is what we're aiming for, you'll start to see that those lessons will be applied across multiple organizations, notwithstanding the fact that they didn't themselves have that incident.
It's like running a PIR within your own organization when you've had any kind of IT disruption or outage. Take that moment to look at it with the wonderful clarity of hindsight and help provide those recommendations back to the rest of us on, well, how can we avoid a similar item or a similar issue occurring for us in future? I think personally, I hope that, we get real actionable kind of recommendations out of this. I think sometimes, we can look at breaches and incidents that have happened to other organizations, and we can raise a sharp focus on one particular cause and not look at it holistically. Anyone who's at CISO is probably very used to the question of like, can that happen here? And what do we need to do to not let that happen here? So look, hopefully we get some wonderful reporting and intelligence out of the board that can help us with those conversations, because they're not easy. They're not easy. Do you come across those a lot when you're dealing with clients and dealing with boards? Like, hey, what happened at organization A, B, and C? Please tell me how that does not happen here.
Every incident, when you see a large incident, impacting financial services, healthcare, education, and suddenly the phone starts ringing and all the CISOs are trying to gather information to try and work out, could this happen to us, and how do we prevent that from occurring? Look, I think the other thing, just to be mindful of these look back exercises, you mentioned the benefit of hindsight, and we all know in daily life when something goes wrong, you wish you didn't do it that way again, and you don't do it the next day, tomorrow. We understand that, but incident response is so dynamic and so fast paced and so dependent on many different factors, resources, the human will, capacity, people's ability to endure over a period of time and not make stupid mistakes when we get tired. Like, there's so many things that go into it. So to your point, let's find out, these nuggets, but let's also make sure that we recognize that where things do go wrong, that we don't over focus on that either, because I think that's my fear, is making sure it's not balanced.
Do you think that the bill may achieve its intended goals of enhancing cybersecurity by, in getting to that 2030 kind of nirvana that it talks about? And what further measures do you think might be necessary to address any gaps or concerns?
So I think right now, the sentiment from a lot of organizations is that there's a lot of change. And I mean, we're talking about one small piece of legislation. There's whole heaps of stuff happening at the moment with privacy law reform, with the cybersecurity strategy, all this. I think a lot of organizations are feeling really overwhelmed at the moment, and they're just trying to wrap their head around how do we make sense of this and how do we put one foot in front of the other in relation to this. And so what we're saying to clients is, to directors, to CISOs, and anyone listening into this, is to say, just start proactively engaging now with this material. This legislation isn't in force yet, but it doesn't mean you can't start to understand it now. We're also saying to focus on your incident response plans. It comes back to my point right at the start, making sure you're building these pathways into your incident response plan so that you can navigate this when they do come live. And again, testing it so that you actually can operationalize that internally before you then having to do it in real life. I think bigger picture, to answer your question, cybersecurity resilience and security breach questions, they're always going to occur. But I think longer term, it's now going to become much more public. The lid is going to be lifted on these issues much more than they have in the past. And, that's not such a bad thing either. Again, being the optimist, if we can move away from cyber being a taboo topic, remove the stigma associated and the shame associated with these events and join forces as a community, we will become much more stronger together. But the only thing I would say is that we have to recognize we also, as a community, have evolved since 5 years ago. There's a much greater public expectation now. Your staff, your customers have a much greater understanding and appreciation for the value and the risks associated with their data handling. We've got regulators who have much more appetite, much more funding than they ever did before to investigate. We've got law reform. It's all sending the signal that there will be consequences to some degree for these events going forward. So I'm an optimist. I think that we've come a long way as a business community in the last 5 years, but we've still got more work to be done, right, between now and 2030. So early engagement is critical, is what I'll say.
I love that you're an optimist. I very much try to be a pragmatic individual myself. I don't think it needs to be all doom and gloom. I don't think CISOs and security teams really need to be, pushing that fear and panic button all the time. You do have to live with some risk, and you do have to collaborate and communicate that well so that people understand what you are doing and also what you're not doing. But my question is, do you see things getting better and moving in the direction that you're hoping that they will, or that you're thinking that they should?
I think that this is somewhat a generational issue. I think that it's going to be in sharp focus for the next 5 to 10 years. Absolutely. It's not going away. It'll never go away. But I think the rub on this is probably just being felt right at the moment. I think over the next 5 years to 10 years, we will get to where we need to be. But as I say, there still needs a lot more investment from organizations. Bigger picture, though, we need to start connecting dots. There should be a world where MSPs, insurers, the DFA community, CISOs are all walking in together from the board and saying, hey, we all slightly have different experiences and slightly have different fields of expertise. We're actually all saying the same thing, though, which is this is how we need to manage this risk. So I think what I encourage the government in particular in the cybersecurity strategy going forward into the next horizons, and the strategy is brilliant. They've kind of broken it down into how we want to get there, but it's connecting the big levers in our industry to try and, on an aggregate level, reduce cybercrime risk and ultimately allow our organizations to become more resilient.
Reece, thank you so much for sharing your incredible insights with us and sharing your voice with us today.
Thanks, David.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Cyber Voices. Our music is by Sanar Garut, our show artwork is by Studio Quarantine, and we record our show at This Is a Studio in Pran, Melbourne, part of Popplant Productions. Please make sure you follow the show on your podcast platform of choice and leave us a 5-star review. This will help others find the show. Also, please follow the association on LinkedIn and Instagram. If you want to add your voice to our ever-growing chorus of diverse cyber voices, have questions, feedback, or would like to be a sponsor, you can do so by emailing us at cybervoices@aisa.org.au. That's cybervoices@aisa.org.au. Are you an AISA member? If not, you should consider joining our network of over 12,000 members across Australia. An AISA membership can open doors, build professional networks, create lifetime friendships, and offer exclusive training, events, and other perks. Become a member today by heading to our website at aisa.org.au. That is all for today. I hope you will join us again next time on Cyber Voices.